we've had quite considerable media interest from across the UK in the report, which is fantastic. And we've had coverage in the Herald, the National, the Belfast Telegraph, a variety of local papers across England, everything from the Surrey Comet to the Shropshire Star, and even in the Jersey Evening Post. So a whole range across literally top to tail of the United Kingdom of coverage of the event today. And we also have an excellent range of speakers today, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them for joining us at this launch event. Now, this report, which is being discussed today, is really important as it provides an invaluable insight into the conditions that affect refugees and asylum seekers' experiences of harmful alcohol use in the UK, and provides recommendations for policy and practice that could hardly be more timely or relevant. The study has assessed the experiences of and perspectives regarding harmful alcohol use among people seeking asylum and refugees in Scotland and England. The study involved interviews with 6 members of staff working in third sector organisations and 20 individuals with current experience of seeking asylum in the UK. The burden of alcohol harm falls disproportionately upon the most vulnerable and marginalised in our society, and this includes people who have been made destitute as the result of a rejected claim for asylum, and who, as a result, have very few places to turn for help or support. The recommendations in this report point the way towards crucial changes that need to be made to address the situation, and that can continue to reduce alcohol-related harm across the UK. I'd like to thank our researchers, Dr. Fiona Cuthill and Dr. Steph Grohmann, and our speakers, who are Michelle Major from the Homeless Network Scotland and Mahdi Saki from Glasgow Night Shelter for Destitute Asylum Seekers, for their contribution to this event. And most importantly, we'd like to thank the individuals and families who shared their experiences, enabling us to gather evidence and tell people's stories. And thank you to all of our participants who gave their time so generously. So now I'm going to be handing over to Dr. Fiona Cuthill and Dr. Steph Grohmann, who will be presenting their report findings and recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Can I just check that everyone can hear me? Okay, that's lovely. Yep. So it's lovely to welcome you all today. Thank you for that welcome, Lindsay. I'm Dr. Fiona Cuthill, and I'm a senior lecturer in nursing studies at the University of Edinburgh, and I'll leave Steph, my colleague, to introduce herself later on. We're going to present to you this really interesting study that we undertook last year, and I'm going to talk initially about the context of the study, the context of asylum in the UK and alcohol policy, and then Steph and I both collected the data. We both undertook these interviews, but Steph did the majority of the data analysis and the writing up of this report. So Steph is going to report on the nuts and bolts of how we did this study and what our major findings are, and then I'll come back in at the end to think a little bit about our recommendations for policy. So just to start, a picture. And I was thinking about our report today, and you know, this is a really serious and heavy report that weighs on us as individuals and also as a society. And just a nice picture to brighten up a dark winter Tuesday afternoon. For all of us, we need something to look forward to. We need to look forward to COVID ending, getting through this tunnel, getting to next summer, where we might end up on a beautiful Tyree beach as it is here. But this also acts as a visual metaphor, and it acts as a visual metaphor for those who flee their country because of torture and war and persecution and violence and conflict, and come to Europe and to the UK because they have this hope for a safe future. They have a hope for somewhere that is going to give them safety and security and a new life away from the dangers that they've left. And while this picture speaks of hope, the metaphor is also quite flawed, because for many people, they don't necessarily get to the end point. And certainly the tunnel that they have to go through is not necessarily as short or as wide as this tunnel. The tunnel is often extremely dangerous. It can involve, as we know, dangerous journeys across various seas. It can involve hazardous trips on lorries. It can involve getting on flights that you don't necessarily know the destination. And the asylum process itself is a winding and long road. For some it's 6 months, for some it can be several years. There's many twists and turns to that as we go along. And so while this presents a metaphor, it is very much flawed. And yet one thing is that we all need hope. We need that the dream that we have is going to, in one way or form, become a reality. And that's very much the context for asylum in the UK. Now, while I've already said that our report is serious and it weighs heavy, it's also within the context of asylum that 54% of people who come to the UK who claim asylum, so asylum comes from the word asylus, the Greek word for safety, who claim safety and sanctuary in the UK are granted it. Around 54%, that was the figures from March 2020 from the government. Now, there's roughly about another 10 or 12% are given leave to remain or humanitarian support on appeal. So that we're talking somewhere about 65 to 70% of people who come to claim asylum are given a form of leave to remain or humanitarian support. And so that is the wider context that this study sits within. Now, this is very much a partnership of research. It wouldn't have been possible without the participants who very bravely talked about harmful alcohol and drug use, who told stories that were traumatic to them, and many who said that they found it really shameful to tell their story. Also to people who worked in community and charitable organisations in Scotland and England, and told of their experiences of working as key workers in this field day in, day out. Homeless Network Scotland, Michelle Major and Claire Frew were great. They were really on board with this research from the beginning and helped us to put us in contact with different refugee organisations. And of course SHAAP, and particularly Eric Carlin, who really took a chance on us. This was really difficult research to do. It's a very hidden population, and add on that, there's a lot of stigma about harmful alcohol use. So it was really difficult, this research, in order to contact people, for people to trust us with their stories. And Eric took that risk with us and funded this research at the beginning. And we really are very grateful to him for that, and to Lindsay and other colleagues in SHAAP for this launch. So what's the background to the study? Oh, I just need to change my grid because I can't see it for faces. Okay. So in general, the burden of alcohol-related harm represents 5% of the global burden of disease, according to the World Health Organization. We know that there's high rates of mortality, morbidity, so death and illness, and economic and social factors are hugely related to excessive alcohol consumption. And the World Health Organization estimate that at more than 3 million deaths globally per year. Interestingly, 3/4 of these are among men. And alcohol has been identified as the second largest risk factor for disease burden in Europe and the leading risk factor for Americas and the Western Pacific. So this is a really important topic. But what is really surprising, and what was surprising and what really prompted Steph and I to undertake this research, is that we know much of the literature talks about the way that we can use alcohol in order to manage trauma and mental ill health as a form of self-medication, as it were. And we also know that trauma is a commonly cited risk factor for people who come as asylum seekers or refugees who are fleeing really traumatic experiences, including war, torture, conflict and violence. And yet the literature, the research literature on this is extremely limited. We found very, very little literature on this. And so we started to ask the questions, why isn't there this literature? Anecdotally, we'd heard from various organisations, people working in the field, that harmful alcohol and drug use was high, particularly amongst people who had been through the asylum system and refugees and were destitute, and yet there was very little research around that. So this really prompted our question, and we wanted to assess the experiences of and perspectives regarding harmful alcohol use among people seeking asylum and refugees in both Scotland and England. Why Scotland and England? Partly to increase our base for recruitment, but also there is different alcohol policies in Scotland and England, and most notably in Scotland is the minimum unit pricing that we don't have in England. So we wanted to see if there was a difference between those two countries of the UK. Some of you will be extremely knowledgeable about the UK asylum system context and others not at all. So I'm just going to give a really sweeping overview of the context. Now, asylum and refugees are not devolved. They're managed by the UK Home Office, regardless of where in the country people are placed. Now, the UK is a signatory to the 1951 Convention on Refugees, and this means that anybody who comes to our shores, whether that's a port or an airport, that we are obliged under international law to give people refuge, safety, asylum, while their case is determined. So there's a period of time from when you come to claim asylum, safety at the border, and then your case is processed by the Home Office. And it's processed by a specific organisation, agency, and that's called Asylum Support, formerly NAS. And this is a completely parallel system of welfare and support. Now, this is really important when you get to the end of this process, but just now it's just to know that this is separate to the benefit system, separate to housing needs. The Home Office runs asylum support as a completely independent, separate entity in itself that's not connected to our ordinary welfare or benefit system. So people seeking asylum are provided with basic accommodation in dispersal areas. Now, around the year 2000, there was too much pressure, particularly around Heathrow and Gatwick and around Dover, the ports, too much social and political pressure. So the UK government at the time set up a dispersal system. And what happened was that different cities in the UK set up housing contracts with the Home Office, and the housing contract then became a dispersal area. So in Scotland, Glasgow is the main dispersal area, and there's various dispersal areas around the UK, Middlesbrough, Leeds, Manchester, various ones around England. So people are, when they arrive to claim asylum, their case is processed by the Home Office and they're sent to a dispersal area on a no choice basis. So you might never have heard of Glasgow, or you might never have heard of Leeds. Most people have heard of London, but you'll be sent on a no choice basis around the country. Now, you can access NHS services while your claim for asylum is being determined. And as I said, that can take from 6 months to several years. Admission to the UK strictly prohibits any form of work or paid employment. You are not allowed to work in any way, shape or form. And if you do, then the benefit that you're given will be taken away. You're provided with basic accommodation and you're given around £37 for a single person per week. You don't pay your bills on top of that. And there's an increasingly wide literature base looking at boredom and mental ill health and the consequences of this for the asylum system. So people come expecting to be able to work, expecting to be able to contribute, and are really shocked to find that they can't. They just have to sit around all day, and this really impacts on mental health. So the determination of an asylum case by the Home Office can take anywhere between 6 months and several years. In our report, we report that 48% of asylum claims are granted at the beginning. Now, that's because we wrote the report a few months ago, and recent government statistics take that up to 54%, but that fluctuates year on year. And then there's another 10–12% on appeal after that. So roughly 65 to 70% of people come, but that leaves 30 to 35% who are not successful in their claim. And this is really important because at this point, at the end of your claim for asylum, refusal is really catastrophic. People are sent a letter that they must leave their accommodation within 15 days. And on that letter, it's suggested that they apply for voluntary return to their country of origin. Now, some people do take up that, but for many they don't, for many different reasons. The main one is because people believe that they have a claim for asylum and safety, but haven't necessarily had documentation or been able to prove it. Another one is that their country might not recognise them as residents. They might not have come on documents that are travel documents that are recognised by their country. And there's a huge fear of imprisonment, torture and danger on return to a country of origin. And so people end up living in a shadowland. Now, this is nothing new. I've worked in the asylum field for 20 years, and there have been many, many reports in almost every city in the UK arguing about this need to recognise destitution following the asylum system. If we go back a few years, Amnesty International ran a campaign called Living Ghosts. There's been other campaigns called Still Human, Still Here. This recognition that although people don't have full citizenship status, and yet they're still here. The latest reiteration is people are termed no recourse to public funds. And that's a bit of a mouthful, and it isn't only people who have got to the end of their asylum claim, but certainly this is the narrative that we talk about today. So asylum refusal frequently leads to destitution. In the UK, when you reach this stage, then your free entitlement to NHS care stops and you'll be charged for any care. You also don't have entitlement to primary cares, to GP and community services, although it is recognised that many GP practices do turn a blind eye to people who are refused or just don't know the status has changed. And most asylum seekers, of course, are unable to pay any costs for healthcare because then they're termed as foreign nationals. So we wanted to also look at different UK alcohol policies, and there are significant policy differences between Scotland and England. In Scotland, alcohol policy is I guess, more active. The Scotland's alcohol policy in 2018 laid out 20 key measures in the Scottish Government's national prevention aims. And the most important in relation to this study was minimum unit pricing, because what minimum unit pricing did was increase the cost of very cheap alcohol, and particularly that's of note for people who are homeless and are street drinking. England hasn't had an updated alcohol strategy since 2012. Certainly there's been calls to update the strategy across different organisations in England, and actually alcohol duty levels in England have been frozen or cut in recent years, and there isn't a government review on alcohol duty. So we wanted to see if it was different across Scotland and England, the way people used alcohol, and also how they used alcohol to manage and through the refugee study. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Steph, and she'll take it from here.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Great, fantastic. So, hello everyone, my name is Steph Grohmann. I'm a Labour Human Early Career Fellow at the Centre for Homelessness and Inclusion Health, and together with Fiona have worked on this study that I'm very proud to present today. And I'm going to take you a little bit into the nitty-gritty of what we did and what we found about this question. So our study was a qualitative study. That means so we didn't do a big survey with a huge sample of people, and we're not making any statistical claims in our report. But we spoke to a relatively small sample of people in depth about their experiences, about their opinions, trying to find out what the complex of topics around harmful alcohol use means to them in their situation. So as Fiona mentioned, we spoke to 20 people with experience of the UK asylum system and 6 members of staff who work with this group. Of those 20 individuals, only 3 were female, the rest were male, which is somewhat representative of the refugee population on the whole, which is overwhelmingly men. Ages was a big range. The youngest participant was 23-year-old, the oldest was 65. We don't have any consistent data on nationalities because some respondents didn't want to disclose specifically where they were from. I'm going to say a little more about that in a minute, but there was a certain anticipation and certain fears around disclosing particular information. So some respondents told us the country they were from, someone only mentioned the continent, some said nothing at all. And on that basis, the majority of the people we spoke to came from Africa or the Middle East, and a smaller group from Southeast Asia. And they'd been in the UK from between 3 years up to 25 years and spent various amounts of that time in the asylum process or appeals process in some capacity. So with these people, we conducted semi-structured interviews. That means we had a number of interview questions, a number of themes that we wanted to speak to people about, but we didn't have a particular questionnaire. So it wasn't a matter of just ticking boxes or ticking off questions. On the one hand, so because there is very little knowledge about this topic, so we didn't want to sort of preclude the questions that we can ask because of things that we don't know. We wanted to remain open to unexpected and unanticipated results. And also, and I'm going to say a little more about in a minute, in order to create a more equitable position between us and our respondents. So the interviews took place on the premises of third sector organizations. Third sector here means any kind of non-governmental organization, charities, associations working with this respondent group, and our asylum seeker respondents were also recruited through these organizations. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So a quick word about study ethics. When people hear research ethics, the first thing that always comes to mind is informed consent. So in any kind of study that involves human participants, it's always important to make sure that the people you're talking to know who you are, who you work for, why you're asking them questions, whether or not they have to answer your question, what's going to happen, etc., etc. And you can't necessarily anticipate that everyone is aware of that. And especially when you're working with a very marginalized group such as this one, it's important to put a lot of thought before you start your study into what could possibly be going through this person's head when asked to participate in this study. So to give you one example, I talked to one respondent in the course of the study who, it turned out during the interview, who was in alcohol treatment and who believed that the Home Office was monitoring their alcohol treatment progress and would punish them possibly by deportation if they slipped up. And now there I turn up as a formal researcher from a university asking questions about their alcohol treatment, and this person naturally concluded there is a connection between these two things, and that in some way they might have to speak to me, or that I might otherwise report to the Home Office that they are being troubled. So of course it doesn't necessarily have to be true that the Home Office is doing this, but what is important for us as researchers is that the person might believe that the Home Office is doing this and act accordingly and feel that they have no choice but to talk to us and answer our questions. So that is the sort of considerations that went into our study design. So other things that we were thinking about was, would people possibly believe that they can't get any help from their respective sector organizations if they don't talk to us? What are they going to make of our consent forms? Are there any issues around language, around literacy, around how people from various cultural backgrounds understand signing such a bureaucratic form? And then, of course, that the majority of these people that we were talking to had a lot of experience with bureaucracy around the topics of asylum, with being asked to participate in interviews that are more or less interrogations by a state agency that's asking them a lot of very intimate, very probing questions, and that they might be asked to sign forms that they do not fully understand, or the consequences of which they do not fully understand, and they might be wary of this kind of bureaucracy. So these were all things that we then addressed with respondents before we asked them to sign these forms. Of course, we always have to be very, very careful about data protection, but we have to be extra careful in a situation where there might be governmental interest in certain kinds of data. For example, when someone with an insecure migration status discloses any kind of criminal activity, this might be something that the Home Office or somebody else, state agencies, might be interested in. So we had to think about, what do we do if this kind of data comes up in our interviews? How do we make sure that this doesn't get into the wrong hands? And finally, also, it's kind of customary in this kind of social research to offer people a little thank you for donating their time to us. So these interviews were between an hour, hour and a half. So our respondents took quite a lot of time out of their day to talk to us. And so as a little thank you, we offered them supermarket vouchers, so to buy food, toiletries, whatever, for £20. And of course, here too, there are arguments to be made that this kind of transaction could potentially create ethical problems when you're talking to people who are destitute, who are literally starving, for whom this food voucher is not just a nice little something to say thank you, but might actually be a matter of survival. And then what does that situation do to people's ability to freely consent to participate in an interview? So these were all things that we were talking about, and I'm telling you about them to give you a little bit of context of what it's like to do this kind of research with this group of persons, and why we did it the way that we did. We did receive, of course, ethical approval from the University of Edinburgh. And could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And here you see a few examples of the kinds of interview questions that we asked, that we had in our interview plan. So as I said, we didn't conduct a questionnaire so much as use these topics and themes to start a conversation, prompting people to talk about their own experiences, or, as you can see here, third people's experiences, friends, family members, etc. On the one hand, because they might really know third parties who might have struggle with alcohol problems, but also because some people might not be comfortable talking about this sensitive topic and might prefer to dress up their own experience as somebody else's experience, because that might make it easier to talk about this. Thank you. Help. No, the presentation is running off. So our one top key finding, most important finding, was that absolutely everyone we spoke to, refugee or staff respondent, said that there is a connection in this population between their status within the asylum process and their relationship to alcohol, and specifically harmful alcohol use. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here's a quote. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to read that for yourself. That sums up very well how this connection was made. So this is a very representative example. So what this person is saying is basically that alcohol use is hardly a problem when people arrive. Few people drink when they arrive from their countries of origin, and when they do, it's usually not problem drinking, which makes sense if you think about, you know, how arduous these refugee journeys can be, and someone with a very active severe alcohol problem might not even be able to make it all the way to the UK. And surprisingly, even though the asylum process can be very, very lengthy and very, very stressful, that is also not when harmful alcohol use usually starts. When it does start is when asylum decision comes and the asylum decision is negative, and that is basically the end of the line for that person's hope to be granted asylum in the UK. And that is exactly when the problem starts. And this was something that consistently, absolutely everyone said that we interviewed. Next slide, please. Thank you. As Fiona already said, there are important differences in alcohol policy between Scotland and England, but they weren't reflected in our data simply because for our respondents, what was way more significant was the fact that asylum policy is the same across Scotland and England, since it's not a devolved matter. And so they were all essentially in the same boat regarding their reasons to drink, and alcohol policy did not make a significant difference in that population. Alcohol was generally seen as simply a cheap remedy for stress, for mental illness, for violence, for all the stresses of becoming destitute in the UK. And the metaphor was used that people try to medicate their own problems with alcohol, of course, in a way that ends up getting them into a harmful spiral. Next slide, please. Thank you. The significant alcohol problems started after an asylum claim was rejected. As Fiona also said, this is the part where people have to move out of their accommodation, usually within a very short space of time. They lose all access to financial support, and they lose all access to using the NHS. So they no longer have recourse to public funds, and that essentially means destitution. So that is literally means putting these people out on the street without any kind of support. And if you're following public discourse on these issues, then you may have had the argument, so well, if there's that many people on the streets who are not from the UK, who've already been through the asylum process, then why don't they just go home? And the problem is, of course, that just going home after your asylum claim has been rejected is often not that easy. There is a system of voluntary return for people who want to return to their home countries, but of course many do not want to, because what's expecting them in their countries of origin is violence, persecution, etc. Some cannot return because they don't have any identification or travel documents, and their countries of origin say, well, without a passport or any identification, one cannot take this person back. So there are, some still have family and friends in the UK, so there are various reasons why people, even when they end up in this very, very desperate situation on the street, do not choose to simply return to their home countries, and instead choose less or productive ways of coping, such as alcohol or drugs. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the most important factor that made the difference in whether or not a person succumbed to harmful alcohol use was simply the ability to somehow positively project themselves into the future, to have some sense of agency. As long as my asylum claim is not decided, at least there's something that I can do. I can behave well, and then maybe they'll decide in my favor. So there's a sense that some good things might still be behind the horizon, even if the current situation is relatively dismal. The process itself, of course, is very, very stressful, because people live with the uncertainty of not having their claim decided for many years, decades in some cases, during which time there are options of what they can do in terms of work, in terms of becoming productive members of the community, are very, very limited. They can, of course, volunteer, which is important for many in order to just simply stave off the boredom and social isolation as well, of not being able to enter the society of the country that you've just traveled to, because you don't have the point of connect that is work or any similar activity. And when that when that was followed by a negative decision, then that was basically perceived as or experienced as the end of the line. And after that, it wasn't so much that people wanted to drink, but it was that people lost all reasons not to drink. Next slide, please. So here's another quote that sums this up very, very well. It's so this person is talking about mental torture. So this whole uncertainty is very, very difficult in terms of mental health. People also, several respondents told us that it comes with a complete and utter loss of identity. So whoever you were, whatever social role you had in your country of origin, you cannot reproduce it in the UK. You can also not try to find a new role as long as you are fixed in this position of asylum seeker. And in terms of this data emerging, you start to see that it's not so much the question of why people drink under these circumstances, but the question is rather why some do not. Next slide, please. Thank you. So mental health issues were amongst the things that people brought up first of all, both in terms of their own experience and in terms of people they knew. So nearly everyone that we talked to had this one friend or acquaintance who was in the asylum process and then developed a very strong alcohol habit and ended up with serious mental health issues. This, of course, has to do also with the fact that there is this community of people who are in this situation is very isolated from the rest of society. And so within this community, certain habits, certain forms of communication, also things like violence, etc., push people further towards a certain kind of coping style. And of course, many refugees and asylum seekers already come to the UK with a lot of pre-existing trauma, either from their countries of origin or from the stresses of the refugee journey. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this especially goes for women, many of whom have already experienced violence, for example, in the context of armed conflict in their countries of origin. For women and girls, the refugee journey is especially dangerous in terms of sexual violence. And then once they arrive in the UK, the poverty and the destitution often leaves them no chance but to engage in prostitution, engage in sex work, which also comes with a disproportionate risk of encountering all sorts of violence. So there is all this trauma piling on top of each other, and then alcohol becomes a non-productive way of coping with this. Next, please. Thank you. So there was a clear connection here between the start of destitution and the onset of harmful drinking. Participants did not always clearly distinguish between alcohol and the consumption of other drugs, mostly illegal drugs. So the ones they cited most was the green stuff, which is probably means cannabis, and then the white stuff, which is various powders, amphetamines, and similar drugs. And all of this was frequently mentioned together with alcohol as a sort of one complex of topics in street culture. So people said that like one big problem is exposure, because the minute you end up on the street and you make connections with other homeless people, you're, even if you haven't been drinking or taking drugs before that, you're inevitably exposed to that. You're also inevitably exposed to drug dealing, because it's one of the other few ways of making money when you're not allowed to work. And also this is perhaps at this point your only social environment, or your only social network that you have left in the world if you're a lone traveler. And there is a certain incentive to join this network for protection, for company, and simply to have somewhere to belong, and then of course also to adopt various positive and less positive habits associated with that. Next, please. Thank you. So among the protective factors that people talked about, so when we asked them, so what kinds of things do you think make it less likely that a person starts drinking too much, was top was meaningful activity, either work, ideally paid work, but in absence that, also volunteering, any kind of connection to the community, be it through their own family. So the people most who said that they were most motivated to resolve their alcohol problem or to not develop an alcohol problem were those who were accompanied by their families, especially children. Children also, of course, giving this sense of, you know, of a future to live for, of hope, of something that is worth not ruining your physical and mental health for. Social support and connection with the third sector was important. Various churches and volunteer organizations that people were involved in, and religion, both in the sense that in some religious traditions there are prohibitions against drinking alcohol, so that was seen as somewhat strengthening people's resolve, those that were believers. And also in a broader sense that religion could give people some kind of meaning in life, some kind of hope to hold on to in this very desperate situation. Next one, please. So yeah, all participants were in principle aware of the local service landscape and where they would want to go, where somebody would want to go if they had a harmful alcohol use and wanted to do something about it. So it's not that the problem is ignorance or that people don't know what's there in terms of help and support. But rather that on the one hand, people weren't sure if what kinds of supports they were allowed to use, especially those who the no recourse to public fund on their files. There is a lot of unclarity about NHS services in this situation, whether they're accessible or not, a lot of confusion amongst asylum seekers, and of course also a certain kind of cynicism, because various people raised the questions, well, yes, even if people know where to get help, why would they seek help? So what would be their motivation? Next slide, please. Thank you. And that same question was raised by staff as well. So staff acknowledged that, you know, no matter what interventions would be possible with a client, how willing they are and how motivated they are to address problematic drinking behavior, it's all very difficult, and it's difficult to make the argument as long as there are such not only as long as there are such grave problems in that person's life, but also as long as there is so little opportunity and actual chance to resolve these problems, because homelessness in itself is bad enough. Homelessness when you have no chance whatsoever to do anything about it, work or any other kind of way, is absolutely soul crushing. And staff did acknowledge that in that situation, well, they raised the question, well, what am I supposed to say to that person? Why am I supposed to say to that person that they should remain healthy, that they should look after themselves, that they should look after their body? So this entire topic of hopelessness was probably the biggest risk factor that was cited across the board. Next, please. And here is another quote to this last point. And this person as well has observed, this person has known quite a few people in this situation, and they have basically observed that this point of being refused that goes along with the point of giving up, where serious drug problems and drink problems are created, and that is also the point where they're becoming very difficult to address via the support system, because that person just starts to slip away. And then I give back to Fiona.
Thank you, Steph, and thank you everybody for staying with us through our presentation. I'm just going to talk through our final 2 slides, which are our recommendations. We have 6 recommendations from the findings of our report. The first is that when asylum is refused, people should either be immediately deported back to their country of origin, or if that isn't possible for whatever reason, continue to be given accommodation after their case is finally determined. People should not be left in this limbo land, this gap, this living ghost state, but should either immediately be returned or given accommodation and support until their case is finally determined. Secondly, we need to develop culturally appropriate mental health services for people who seek asylum to manage both pre-displacement trauma, but also post-displacement trauma, which was really clear through the narratives of our participants. Thirdly, for the UK government to allow people seeking asylum to work and engage in meaningful activity while their claim for asylum is being processed. This is not new. This has been asked for many times. There's currently a big petition going around. Some of you may have signed this and seen this, but taking away the ability to work and meaningful activity has a huge and undisputed impact on mental health. Fourthly, resources permitting financial support for third sector organisations, churches and voluntary groups that provide gender-based violence interventions for women seeking asylum should be increased, so that women who are seeking asylum have resources to deal with trauma and particularly sexual violence. Fifthly, to support educational programmes for staff in third sector organisations to understand harmful alcohol and drug use among people seeking asylum, and to have appropriate support services to refer people to that are accessible and that are culturally appropriate. And 6, further research is required to explore the relationship between harmful alcohol and drug use in Scotland and England, particularly given the increased cost of cheap alcohol following the introduction to minimum unit pricing. So thank you very much for your attention. We're now going to go back to just the group of people before we go into a question and answer session. So 2 different speakers have agreed to speak, not with a PowerPoint, just to speak into the reports. I'm going to ask first of all Michelle Major, who I've already mentioned, from Homeless Network Scotland, who's going to speak into the report from a homeless organisational perspective. And then after Michelle, Mahdi Saki, who has been through the refugee process himself and works as part of Glasgow Night Shelter, will speak into the report in terms of from a refugee perspective. So thank you, Michelle.
Thanks very much, Fiona and Steph. That was an excellent presentation, and even having had sight of the report in advance, just so powerful just to see it all kind of laid out like that. So hi everyone, thanks very much for having me. My name is Michelle Major. I'm a change lead at Homeless Network Scotland, which is a national homelessness charity in Scotland, and we are a member organisation. So part of our role is to bring together expertise and experiences from across the country to connect, learn and act on what we believe is going to lead us to an end to homelessness in Scotland. And as part of my role there, I'm also a member of the project board for the Glasgow Night Shelter for Destitute Asylum Seekers, which I'm sure Mahdi will speak a little bit to after me. I think this research for us is a really powerful tool to influence policy, and it's been launched at what feels like just the right time, given some of the kind of current events and no recourse to public funds policy in the UK at the moment. And I think something that the sector's probably been crying out for a while is that it confirms much of what service delivery staff kind of intrinsically know already from their experience, so that the experiences of the asylum support system and the immigration system are often very traumatic, and that they do force people into often kind of dangerous or hopeless situations. So to be able to have something that kind of gives additional weight to those people's experiences is just such a valuable tool for us all to have moving forward. One kind of key reflection of ours would be that there's been a real separation in the homelessness and the kind of refugee and asylum systems over the years, particularly in Scotland, but I'm sure it's not massively different down south, in that we kind of almost see them as two very separate things, whereas in reality and in people's experiences, they often cross over and often interlink. One thing that's really helped us bring those two systems together has been, oddly enough, the pandemic response. So having that ability with the kind of suspension to some of the rules around NRPF for people to feel more empowered, that they know how to help, and that they know that they're not putting anyone's status in jeopardy by allowing them access to a service, and that kind of thing has really, really helped galvanise a lot of partnerships between those two systems and between those sectors that are just so linked. So I just think, I won't spend much time touching on some of this stuff, but one of the big developments for us in Scotland has been the kind of formation of a collective. It's called the Everyone Home Collective. You'll find more about that at everyonehome.scot if you're interested. And one of their areas of interest has been how to redesign the system as we move forward in a way that's going to design out destitution and kind of take a really human rights based approach going forward to how we work in Scotland. So we kind of know that the destitution that people experience is by design, by the Home Office and by that system, or it's by intent, by people who are trafficked into situations where they then become destitute. We know that there's a lack of rights and awareness around people's entitlements, and we know that loneliness and social isolation are huge factors in people's experiences, which kind of mirrors a lot of what Fiona and Steph have mentioned from their research. And for us, from a homelessness lens, we know that there's just not enough accommodation available as well, which is a real challenge, and what is available can be really patchy in the provision. So there might be people who have got kind of a statutory right to temporary housing under the Immigration and Asylum Act, but then beyond that, it's very kind of patchy, community hosting, night shelters, friends and family. It's not particularly secure. So what that collective is looking to do is just to design a better future, a more preferable future, where they're looking at accommodation, support and advice and filling those gaps, because we know that there's some excellent work that is currently done. It's just maybe not as widespread as it could be, or not as well known as it should be. So looking to just strengthen that. We want to create strategic collaboration between the public, third and academic sector. I think that's one of the things that we're well on the way of doing. We're really, really pleased that the Scottish Government and COSLA have kind of endorsed these plans, and will be kind of folding them into the development of their anti-destitution strategy as well. So just having everything starting to really join up, hopefully is going to have us moving in the right direction. And the really interesting bit, I think, is a kind of forming an innovative 5-year partnership with some funding bodies in Scotland. So while we often will hear that the Scottish Government's hands are tied, Home Office is a Westminster policy, it's all Westminster policies, there's not much that can be done up here. We acknowledge that in a sense, and we partially know that that's a bit of a cop-out. So it's about finding ways around that in the interim, whilst also kind of lobbying to get those changes as soon as possible, but it's obviously more of a long-term journey. And what we hope that will bring is a kind of situation in Scotland where we've been able to design out destitution for all the reasons that Steph has so eloquently highlighted there, and I won't waste anyone's time kind of clumsily going over those. We want a Scotland where everyone has a safe place to stay. We want everyone to be informed and supported, to be able to really exercise their legal rights. And for people who have experience of that system to feel included and involved in the development of all that. So that for us is really, really key. And I think maybe that's actually a nice note for me to stop talking and to let Mahdi have the mic, since he's somebody who has a bit of that experience. So just again, thanks so much, Fiona and Steph, for taking the time to produce this, and hopefully it's something that we can all kind of get behind and use going forward. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michelle. That's great, and it's really great to be part of the Everyone Home Collective as well, and just to see that coming together of refugee issues and sort of more mainstream homelessness issues around no recourse for public funds. Thank you. Mahdi, thank you very much. Can I hand over to you now?
Hello, thank you, Fiona. Hello, everyone. My name is Mahdi. I am working as a participation manager at Glasgow Night Shelter for Destitute Asylum Seekers. It's like maybe a bit noisy. Sorry. Our charity in Glasgow based, we provide accommodation for destitute asylum seekers. We have building in Great Western Road. We have about 17 rooms for 17 people, and it's fast changing. People will referred by our partners, and they will be accommodated here, and the caseworkers worked on their case to be basically move on to home office accommodation if they become eligible for that support. While they are here, we offer food, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and there is a support team here as well. Myself, I am here to work with our guests here to get them involved in service and operation in the charity, in the building, and in decision making. We try and we want every decision made here in the charity. Our guests have voice and they become involved in this process. And also I work with them to link our guests to outdoor activities with other communities, other services like Next Bike membership, cycling, any kind of a sport, going out to walk in the park and register for ESOL class, and etc. And this is what I do here. We have people from varieties, languages, maybe 10 languages, different countries, although they are all men here. Our charity called Glasgow Night Shelter, but actually is not night shelter anymore. Since July, we have 24 hours, 7 days accommodation here. The charity established in 2012 and led by volunteers, but now we have a team of staff, support team, director, service manager, and great donors, funders, partners. We work very closely with our partners to develop our work here. I read the report. I thanks Dr. Fiona, thanks to Dr. Stephanie. I think this is the area where never was investigated or never people look at this alcohol among or use alcohol or self-harm by alcohol among refugees and asylum seekers. Myself, I was 4 years asylum seeker, and now I am a refugee. And I am very familiar with problems among refugees and asylum seekers every day in my work or outside. I found the report. I agree with the report. I confirm this report. I think the key findings, which says the connection between harmful alcohol use and the stress of the UK immigration as an asylum process, is the key finding. And I think, as Dr. Fiona explained about immigration system, I think you're familiar with hostile environment policy as well, which introduced in 2012. This policy actually brings people down, asylum seekers. I talk to many people, they say this system is inhuman. Make people miserable, they become destitute, and the fact that the system put pressure so much on people when they come to UK is to do with the length of the time. Myself, I said like 4 years, some people 10 years, 2 years, 10 years, and this length brings stress, anxiety, misery, and I think the system being created to bring these miseries and stress among these people, to be down. And the most important factor deciding between health and harmful alcohol was hope. In page 4 in this report, I totally agree with this. I think when you come to the UK, you think you landed to the safe country, in a modern country. You will be treated fairly, not the way that dictators in your own country treated you badly, but you lose your hope. You become homeless when you refused by Home Office or by the Immigration Tribunal, and this hope is shattered. There is no hope anymore. You don't have any hope, and long waiting to be accepted, or going to poverty and social isolation is contribute to harmful drinking. Absolutely right. Absolutely. I think harmful drinking is more when asylum seekers become destitute. I agree with that. I work with destitute asylum seekers. I think when you have no access to public fund, when you have no work permission, when you treated less than human, you go to drinking. That's one some people do. They feel that self-mediation or morphine because there is no family around, and if you are destitute, you go socializing with maybe by a group of people who are drinking as well. Protective factors to harmful alcohol use were like meaningful activities, like the accommodation of family to UK, accompany with the family, social support. This is in page 22. I completely agree with that. I think if you have some sense of meaning in your life, if you have some routine in your life, if you know tomorrow you go to work, you go to college, you study, you have a privacy life, you have family around, then you have less belonging or going to the drinking. So this is something, as mentioned, volunteer organization might help you, churches might help you, social charities or voluntary charities might help you. I think I agree with the recommendation, which is in page 5. It says people should accommodate it. I think based on Article 25 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, people should have the right to live in a housing. They must have some shelter or a space to live. Again, in recommendation says people should be permitted to work. I think again in Article 23 in Human Rights Declaration said that people when you're born, you have the work permission. You know, it shouldn't be based on your status. And completely, I think the UK government should listen to this report, should listen to this the researchers who found this research and be supported. And also more research in this area needed. Not one-off. I think this is the first only research been done, but maybe more need to be. In terms of demography of participants, great, because different nationalities, different genders, different age been involved in this report, and I think absolutely great to see my fellow refugees and asylum seekers taking part in this report. Many refugees don't trust people. It's great they trusted you and they came and talked to you. Yeah, there are so many things I've written here to talk to you, but really that was my 10 minutes. I'm happy to talk to you if you want.
Thank you so much, Mahdi. That is really great, and it's yeah, for Steph and I, it's also very encouraging to know that you endorse the main findings of our study. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand back now to, I think, Elizabeth.
Hi, yes. So I've been collating questions as people have been submitting them, and we've got quite a few to get through. So I'm going to run through questions in the order that they were asked and field them to our speakers. So do be patient, we will get around to your question. So just to begin with, Victoria Guthrie had asked a question around interviews and language at interviews. So I'll punt this one to Steph, I think, and she asked, did you have translators for those who are unable to understand or speak English? And as a subsequent question, she was wondering, given the likelihood of trauma, should we not also advocate for more funding for trauma-informed practice alongside appropriate mental health support? So I'll pass that along to Steph and Fiona. You're on mute, Steph.
I'm very sorry. Well, as for the first question, it was actually one of our exclusion criteria that all of our respondents should have sufficient English to take part in these interviews. So all of them did. Simply because also things can get lost in translation, and we wanted to not just have what people said, but we wanted to have the option of like drawing them into a conversation, and that wouldn't have been possible in any other language. And as to the second thing, yes, absolutely. So trauma-informed care should be part of this whole process, including the process of course, taking that person's information for asylum purposes.
That's great, thanks, Steph. And Harpreet Kohli had asked, he recognises that it's a qualitative study, but did the research indicate if age and gender may be associated with alcohol-related harm in this context?
I'm not sure I understand the question, whether there's a relation between age and gender and the likelihood of alcohol, is that?
Related harm amongst your participants. So was age and gender a factor at all with your participants?
Well, it's difficult to say in such a small sample. There were different opinions definitely amongst our respondents. So some said that alcohol is more of a problem with men. Some were adamant, no, it's more of a problem with women. But this is basically their second-hand perception. So from our data, we couldn't see any particular patterns in terms of, well, gender. We only had we had a very skewed sample, and age definitely not. It might be that younger asylum seekers might be more likely to engage in other drug use because they're more likely to be in contact with people who have access to these other drugs apart from alcohol. But that's a bit speculative on the basis of this data.
That's great. And a question from Felicity Garvey. She asked whether refugees that you interviewed from the Muslim faith, did they find their beliefs prevented them from taking to alcohol once in the asylum process, or whether they became absorbed into using it to be part of a community and not excluded for that reason?
This was one of the topics where people like to basically tell third-person stories. So I think this was, for people of Muslim faith, this was a very sensitive topic. This overlap also with not just religious prohibitions, but then also the opinion of their religious community of drinking alcohol. I don't think anyone clearly said, I don't drink because my faith forbids me from doing so, but they did say that, if you're a part of a faith community where drinking is just not a thing, then it's less likely that you will come up with it on your own. Some people, like among the Middle Eastern respondents, said that they would be more likely probably to go with cannabis than alcohol, because it's just culturally a little more acceptable. Yeah, that was basically the scope of it.
Great. And quickly, I'm just going to, there's been quite a few questions around recommendation 1. So I'll just quickly scoot those to the top as multiple people have asked about this. So people have noted that they're a bit uncomfortable with the idea of immediate removal. So I think there's sort of questions around if there could be a bit more clarifying around that particular recommendation and what's meant by that recommendation. And people have registered sort of worries around whether it's safe for people to be removed back to their home country, even if an application for asylum has been rejected. Fiona, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, I do agree, and I take on board those concerns, and we have those concerns ourselves, and we thought long and hard about recommendation 1, and that recommendation is on the premises that the asylum system works, and we know that the asylum system doesn't work, and that many people just have a claim but are not able to prove it, don't understand the system. didn't say certain information on their first interview because it was highly sensitive and embarrassing. And then if they disclose that at a later date, then they're seen as changing their story. And there's a whole massive catalogue of things that go along. I think in terms of recommendations, do you recommend what is realistic, or do you recommend what would be, you know, a whole reform of the system? It is clear that the asylum system needs a total overhaul. And also it's a hostile environment. We live with a government that does not want people here and wants them to go away. And, you know, we can see that with the rhetoric of people coming in the boats across the English Channel as it is. So I really do take on board your concerns about that, about immediate removal, or people should stay until their case is fully determined. And there are many people who end up with no recourse to public funds and destitute, and then manage to go through the system again and have new evidence, and their claim is approved, and they go on to live lives in the UK.
Thanks, Fiona. That's great. I'll just move on to some of our next questions. So Alyssa Ambrose asked, if we use a model of addiction that sees addiction as a manifestation of past trauma, then asylum seekers are at incredibly high risk. And she's asking, can we predict this before they arrive? And wondering if there is any scope in the UK whereby asylum seekers have some kind of tailored support regarding health behaviours or identifying risks on arrival, or does this duty fall to GPs? So I know this sort of dovetails with one of your recommendations. Fiona, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it would be lovely if people arriving did have a full health assessment and risk assessment. But the reality is that some people don't even get signposted to a GP, or don't necessarily have access to GPs. And we all know that GP services are limited as well. There are specialist GP services around the country who are much more in tune, particularly asking questions around torture and previous trauma. But people can go to any GP services. So I agree, in an ideal world that would be great. Unfortunately, the reality, I think, is quite far from that.
That's great, thanks, Fiona. And a sort of, again, a question around ethics from Lucy Holmes, which Steph, perhaps you'll be able to respond to. And she's asked, given how fearful participants might have felt before taking part, was there any thought of using community researchers, peer researchers, to access, contact, reassure, or collect data from participants?
Not in the research design, no. It turned out to spontaneously evolve because some of the respondents actually saw themselves as community ethnographers of sort, and were also quite happy to talk to us as if they so want, ethnographers or anthropologists of their own community. I'm an anthropologist, so these metaphors always come easy. But we did not do that for the entire study, also because the recruitment of respondents was already quite challenging. So we had to try various different angles to even get this amount of people to speak to us, and to coordinate then community researchers in that particular situation and in the time frame that we had wouldn't have been possible. If we did like a bigger long-term study on the same topic and maybe try to recruit a bigger sample, then that would definitely be a good strategy on ethical terms. I agree, yeah.
Thanks, Steph. And we've had a couple of questions around the price of alcohol. So one question highlighting that with minimum unit pricing, cheap alcohol obviously rose in price in Scotland. And a question from Sidra Idris about whether that impacts on any of the participants in relation to how they then afford alcohol. And there's been another question around sort of generally how refugees or asylum seekers afford alcohol more generally, and how that impacts on their vulnerability. I'm not sure if Steph or Fiona, which one of you would like to take that question.
Yeah, we didn't see any difference really between people who talked about harmful alcohol use in England or Scotland. I think a further study that would be interesting is the relationship between when people used alcohol and when they used drugs, and what was the relationship between that. People, as Steph said, people did interesting switch between the two, but the study wasn't looking at that, so we didn't look at those differences in depth. But it was clear that people switched between using alcohol and using other forms of drugs at different times and in different ways, and that would be interesting to know whether it was to do with cost, availability, street culture. What were the reasons behind that? There was some hints, but nothing that we could really speak into. What's your thoughts, Steph?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this that sharing of all kinds of resources, but especially alcohol and drugs, is a big component of street culture and is how communities are made and maintained. So there's not necessarily a need for every single person to afford their own alcohol, but whoever comes into some money buys it for the group. And this is also how solidarities are built, and also why these structures that might then be difficult to leave.
Thanks. I should apologise. I just had a delivery at the door, which is why I had to scoot out for a second. Peter Rice, our chair, I think had a quick comment on this as well. He's just going to comment quickly.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Liz. I saw Sidra's question and others coming in, and I mean, just to comment a little bit on cheap alcohol and poverty more generally, in full recognition that there are additional dimensions for people who are refugees. This was a question that those of us who were involved in minimum price, so Eric, Felicity and other people who are on this call, thought about a lot. Is raising the price of alcohol going to be an additional burden to people on low incomes? I think when you looked at the data, what you found was, in fact, cheap alcohol hits people on low incomes much harder than other groups. One of the reasons that we really got going on this in Scotland was that rates of alcohol deaths, in particular liver disease, had more than doubled over a 10-year period of cheap alcohol in Scotland, and it was people in the lowest income groups who were dying. And in fact, the gap between rich and poor, and there always has been a gap, but that gap was getting greater and greater and greater as alcohol got cheaper. And in fact, we've seen that gap narrow through a number of policy actions in Scotland, and there's some early evidence it might be narrowing with MUP. So I think that the way that we thought about it is that, yes, there will be some people for whom they will end up spending whatever they have trying to get hold of their substance of choice. But in fact, there's a much larger number who will either cut back or indeed will not fall into that problematic use, because the price is a barrier. So I think our judgment, and I think the evidence has supported it as it's unfolded, is that cheap alcohol is not a benefit to people on low incomes. And in fact, removing cheap alcohol has a particular benefit for people who are on very tight incomes, and I certainly hope that proves to be the case for asylum seekers.
That's great, thank you, Peter. And Joseph Baker had asked whether there's any evidence of whether identifying as LGBTQ+ is a risk factor in this area, and whether you had come across that within the context of your research.
No is the answer. We didn't ask that question, and people didn't identify as those links. We didn't. It wasn't a question that we asked, so we don't know that answer. Sorry.
And Eric Carlin has asked a couple of questions. Eric, could I just ask you to unmute and ask your questions, as I think you had a couple there.
Easy questions only, Eric.
Liz, can I ask you to ask them? I can't remember what I asked.
Sure, I have noted them down, so that's fine. So Eric's asked, firstly, so there are two slightly different ones. On one hand, has COVID impacted on these people's experiences and social practices, including alcohol and/or drug use, and do we have any ideas about that? And on the other hand, thinking about ethical issues, how do people think that we can draw attention to health harming but stigmatized behaviors, so alcohol and drug use is a good example, among groups who are themselves stigmatized, like refugees and asylum seekers, in ways that encourage positive, sympathetic and empathetic changes in policy and practice and or media practices and reporting. And it might be a good idea to take that second one first, as I think that's a bit more complex. Fiona, did you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I can do. I mean, I think it'd be fair to say, and Eric, you were part of these conversations that Steph and I had with you at the beginning about how really, you know, we felt like we were going where angels fear to tread, that we were going into an already very marginalized group of people. And then we were asking this sort of further question around harmful alcohol use as well. And our big fear was, how would that be reported? And how would, and I'm not sure the answer. I guess we thought very hard and long about the words that we used and the press releases that went out. I think in the end, if people want to take a certain approach, then they're gonna. But it is true that when you're asking sort of multiple questions that add stigma on top of marginalisation, it is incredibly difficult and sensitive, and you can't guarantee how the media is going to run with that. And I think that's why Steph talked a lot about these really detailed ethical questions that we thought very, very long and hard about before we went into it. And we worked really closely with SHAAP and Elizabeth and Lindsay, thinking about how we were going to present our research and how we were going to frame it and the words that we were going to use to try and minimise that potential harm or not.
Yeah, can I say something then now? I've remembered what I was asking about. I mean, I think I've asked a few questions. I think it's such an interesting and important report. There's so much that's engaging and challenging about it as well. I guess what I'd be really interested to, because it seems that the media, I was asking about the media as well. And the media, people were horrified about this terrible case of the death of the asylum seeker in Glasgow, and it was reported that she died of alcohol poisoning as well. Was one of the media reports. I don't know whether that was substantiated further, but it seems to me that once we get to the stage where this terrible thing happens, everyone kind of wrings their hands about it and says how terrible it is. But how do we change the whole discussion about these issues so we don't get to those stages? I telling the stories, I guess, and humanizing it is part of it, but I wonder if you have any more ideas about what else we can do from the work you've been doing.
Maybe one thing I could say in that context, in connection with the COVID question, is we don't have any data on this specific group of respondents because we are, like all Edinburgh researchers, all UK researchers at the moment, not allowed to do any kind of face-to-face research. So we couldn't do this study under current COVID circumstances. We have been following, of course, what's going on generally with homelessness and asylum in the course of COVID. And one very, very interesting thing that has emerged there is that in a pandemic, all of a sudden, when you have destitute people on the street without access to healthcare, that's not just a problem for them, that's a problem for everyone. And that has become very, very obvious. I mean, it's not been enough, apparently, for the Home Office to not try and evict dozens of asylum seekers in Glasgow the minute they got a chance. But I do think that these questions, or that this is a fantastic angle to address this question, because it's not just an individual health risk, it's a public health risk. And this has just become very, very obvious. And I think it's a momentum worth holding on to while it lasts.
Thanks, Stephanie. That's great. I mean, this isn't the same thing, but Alexandra Taylor has asked if you were able to pick up any data around the influence of alcohol advertising on asylum seekers' consumption while you were doing your work.
No. Not at all. It hasn't come up once.
That's great. Well, what I'm going to do now is we've got through most of the submitted questions. So I was going to open up for follow-up. If you do have a question, obviously I can't see everyone because there's 3 sort of screens with little squares. So if you maybe raise your hand or sort of make yourself known that way, or make yourself known in the chat, then I can ask you to contribute. So if anyone has any follow-up questions or further questions, if you could just type a Q in the chat, I've got it up here and I will see your name coming up. Any further questions or areas that people would like to ask around from the speakers? I can see Victoria Taylor Smith. I'm guessing, is that your hand up, or yeah? Do you want to unmute yourself there?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I just put a question in, just from knowing someone who's had this experience. So have you had any of the participants kind of bring up that they haven't been granted asylum, but they've got family members like their partner, wife and children that have done, but they're like obviously then made destitute themselves, but the family haven't, and how has that impacted them? And was this part of the research done?
Yes, that did actually come up, and that came up as one of the reasons as to why people don't just simply leave the minute their asylum claim fails, because of precisely situations like this. And it can lead to quite absurd scenarios where, for example, a family is still housed, but then one family member, like the father, for example, has their claim refused and has to move out of there, and then, I don't know, potentially try and sneak back in whilst not being allowed to do so. But yes, this kind of absurdity absolutely does happen.
We did have a question around clarification around recommendation number 6. Fiona, I don't have the report open in front of me. Do you know which recommendation that's referring to?
And just having a look. Research needs to explore relationship between harmful alcohol and drug use in Scotland, particularly given the increased cost of cheap alcohol following the introduction minimum unit pricing. Well, I guess minimum unit pricing has increased the cost of cheap alcohol.
That question was from Sidra Idris. Sidra, if you're there and want to unmute and ask a bit more around that question, do feel free.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. I just wanted to ask that it says further research is required to explore the relationship between harmful alcohol and drug use in Scotland. And then the second part, I do get it that you're trying to explore that whether setting up a minimum threshold would have an impact on a refugee consumption or not. But the first part is not clear. The relationship between harmful alcohol and drug use in Scotland, what does that refer to?
Yeah, you can hear me. It refers to well, I guess it can be Scotland and England. It's just because it's a Scottish funded report, but the relationship between harmful alcohol and drug use. So I guess that relates back to what I was saying earlier. So participants talked about how they drank alcohol, but then with various street culture, they might then share drugs, and then they might not drink alcohol and they might use other drugs. So it's that relationship between when they chose alcohol and when they chose other drugs, and what were the reasons between those. Does that make it clearer?
Yes. And secondly, I wanted to ask if when you were doing your research, you came across the impact of solidarity or the networks that these refugee or asylum seekers formulate on the increased use of alcohol. Like eventually when they are in the same situation and then they form a network together, did you observe any effect of that network on increased consumption of alcohol? Like now they have a support system.
Steph, do you want to talk into that one?
The effect of the support system on alcohol use, well, it was one of the things that paper said was basically among their protective factors, or that they saw among the protective factors, and not just in terms of sensitization to alcohol itself, but just generally in terms of the experience of somebody in officialdom, because there's a tendency to see all of officialdom as one big blob, does care about you and does try to help you. So yes, that's definitely a factor.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
And I'm just going to flag up that Mustafa has made the point, it's not a question, but a point around that we need to start thinking of healthcare and access to healthcare as a human right, and that applies to asylum seekers and regardless of status. And I just wondered, either Steph or Fiona, if you had reflections on that from your research or in relation to the recommendations that you've made in the report.
Yes, absolutely. And I would completely agree that healthcare should be a human right, not just in this context, but also in any other context. And that's, of course, a big, big topic where we're also going into, the future of the NHS, etc. But as I just said, it's not just that, it's a human right for the individual. It's also a human right for everyone else, that there aren't people out there who, don't have access to healthcare and might have infectious diseases. And when to make this argument, if not now? It's not just about individuals. It's like, at the end of the day, it's about everyone.
Fiona, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I agree with that. I think there are many issues, but certainly health as a human right is a really important issue and aspect of that. Yeah.
And I noticed that Eric's got another question down here, which I hadn't noticed originally. He's asked, what should future research priorities focus on? I know a number of people have flagged up the need for more research alongside that being one of the recommendations. So do we have a sense, or does anyone else in the audience who might be familiar with this area want to sort of jump in and suggest some future areas of research focus?
I think for me, a future area, which wouldn't be me to do because this is way outside my expertise, but it's actually looking at some sort of cost benefit analysis of what happens when the state makes people destitute and all the subsequent costs that happen as a result of that. So emergency mental health interventions, police visits, sometimes into prison and how much that costs, compared to housing somebody until the very end of the determination of their case, because economics speak into government. And I think if there's that sort of cost benefit analysis performed about how much it costs for alcohol services or for crime reduction or all these other things that happen when people end up becoming destitute by the state and not housed, what that would be compared to if somebody was housed. And I think that would be a really interesting analysis personally.
Does anyone else want to add any areas that they feel are worth investigating further? That's great. I've noticed, Eric, there's another question from you there. Sorry, I missed, there are sort of 4 or 5. But Eric has, it's good. Eric has asked if you found significant differences between the English and Scottish context, given that you interviewed people in both England and Scotland.
I would be very, very careful with asserting big differences between Scotland and England on the basis of this data, because it's a very small sample. That said, I do think there's a sense that in Scotland, while asylum policy is the same, there is both a better support system in place in Scotland and also somewhat a different attitude maybe in the population, in the third sector, in the rest of the paper that you encounter. which may have to do with, you know, Scotland trying to positively differentiate itself from England in that regard. But as I said, that is more speculation than what the actual data gives us.
Thanks, thanks, Steph. I've just noticed there's another question here from Udita Mitra, who's asked that he thinks minimum unit pricing is a great idea, but wants to know from the interviewers, oh, sorry, I lost it there, wants to know from the interviewers whether the people they spoke to, sort of how they articulated ideas around self-harm, and whether any of the recommendations proposed sort of link in with questions around self-harm or kind of reduction of antisocial behaviour and other areas such as that. Fiona, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, I'll probably hand it over to Steph actually, in terms of the data analysis.
Yes, there were definitely references to self-harm, but paper did not necessarily talk about alcohol consumption as a form of self-harm. So there wasn't this explicit connection. People talked about it in the sense, so there's people being made destitute, people losing all hope, then they get depressed and, you know, they think about suicide, and that's when the alcohol comes in. So they were aware that, you know, alcohol causes ill health effects, but they didn't necessarily see that as a form of self-harm, but they saw it as as part of a general state of affairs where the person just simply loses the will to live and then acts accordingly, either by actively harming themselves or by just passively stopping any kind of intervention that would promote their health.
Thanks, Steph. And actually, Sidra has just asked a follow-up question. She's wondering how effective a cost-benefit analysis would be if the government sort of immediately removes people after the refusal of a claim. Wouldn't that then just mean that people weren't their problem anyway? And I'll pass that over to Fiona or Steph, depending on who feels better placed to answer that question.
Yeah, of course, that's a risk. I guess the cost benefit analysis would be between people who are currently, as the system stands, in terms of that when people's cases are refused and then they've got 15 days to be evicted, and then periods of weeks, months or years that they are destitute, and what happens to people in and out of that whole process.
And just from Mustafa again, he's wondering whether there's a comparison between refugees and economic migrants in relation to the effects of trauma and sort of issues faced after arrival in the UK.
Not that I know of. Does anyone else?
Not in terms of hard data as far as I know, but there is some like circumstantial research, so to speak, that to some extent for any migrant arriving in a new country, leaving everything behind, is a somewhat traumatic experience. But of course, there is a wide scope here between fleeing war and, you know, deciding to maybe move somewhere for a job. There's also evidence that the experience of being a migrant somewhere and maybe encountering xenophobia, racism, rejection, and so on, also leads to mental ill health, like depression, etc., which can then also, of course, lead to alcohol abuse. But we don't have any hard data to compare these two groups quantitatively.
Can I actually ask a quick question? And this is mainly arising from my ignorance of the area generally, but the prohibition on work, you know, what logic is that grounded in? Is that simply to deny a potential avenue of legal sort of stay for people who arrive, or is there some sort of logic around that prohibition?
I I think it's multiple. I think it's not allowing people to become established, I think, as well, before their case is determined. I think it's also a huge element of social control. So people, when they're part of the asylum system, are very tightly controlled by where they're placed, what their housing is, what money they're given. There's a huge element of social control and of being managed. You have to go to local post office to get your money. You're kept in the same area. You can't travel around. You can't decide where you want to live. And I think it just adds to that, of that temporariness of being here until the government decides on your fate.
Right. So
I don't know, Mahdi, do you have any other perspectives on that?
I think the Home Office doesn't like people be engaged with other people, be more isolated. They don't want you establish a new life here. They don't want you be to develop your career. They want you be the skilled person, to be unused, to be unprofessional. You don't have life here. You're abandoned here. That's why they don't give you work permission. Otherwise, if you have a work permission, you will find a friends, you establish new life, you engage with other people, you save money, you pay tax. But it's just breaking human rights, and they do that anyway.
So it's pretty counterintuitive, given that protective factors to harmful alcohol use are engagement with other people and meaningful activity. And yeah, thank you, Mahdi. Victoria has a quick question, and then just to finish off, Eric has one last question. Victoria was wondering whether there was any data on the kinds of alcohol that people used.
Yes, so people were talking about like a range of drinks. So usually it was beer or cider, and especially, of course, the cheap types of cider. And in rare cases, so they did make a difference between drinking beer socially and then drinking liquor or hard alcohol and possibly on your own. So they saw this as a sort of descent from weaker sorts of alcohol to stronger ones.
Thank you. And Eric's last question is, he's asking, thinking about individual agency, how did people avoid harm and or get out of difficulties? So he's noted that churches, engagement with church or religious bodies is a protective factor, but also seems to have some negative impacts in some respect. And he just wondered whether you could explore that a little further.
Could I just ask what he means by the negative effects of faith?
Do you want to?
Yeah, judgmental. So rather than the religious agencies being there as supports, they would stigmatize and ostracize people.
Oh,
who
yes,
got into this.
that is definitely, and that was quite palpable in the way that people, like especially Muslim people from religious backgrounds, where there's an alcohol prohibition, talked about alcohol consumption, because this is not something that you want to attribute to yourself, even in front of a person who, you know, isn't of that faith and doesn't really care. But that social taboo is very, very deeply ingrained. And yes, of course, in that context, individual alcohol consumption can become quite isolating from people's own community.
But you also had churches there as support systems as well, didn't you?
Well, it goes both ways. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. So it's the same possibly with family. You know, on the one hand, family might motivate you to keep yourself together. On the other hand, you might like hide your own alcohol consumption from family and then become isolated from family due to
that. Just before we wrap up, are there any outstanding questions that anyone would like to raise that I haven't noticed? If you've got your camera on, I can probably see you waving at me. Lindsay, I can see waving.
Just a very quick question, and following on from something I was going to ask about actually, which was what types of alcohol had been consumed, was where, if there was any mention of kind of where they obtained the alcohol. I saw there was one mention of kind of a local, local shops in the report. Do you think, did it seem that local shops or supermarkets or kind of online, or how did people get hold of the alcohol?
I think largely local shops, yes, especially kind of 24/7 shops.
Yeah.
Like online wasn't a factor at all, because none of these people had a proper delivery address or internet device like where you can just order things easily.
Great, thank you.
That's great. Well, if there aren't any final questions, I think Lindsay just had a few closing comments. So I'll hand back to her, but just say a big thank you to all our speakers and to Stephanie and Fiona for fielding questions.
Absolutely, thank you very much for attending this launch event today. It's been a really interesting discussion. We've had some very kind of searching questions, some challenging questions as well for our report authors, and it's really given us a lot to go away and think about, and in terms of future research and how can we take this forward. I think there's a lot that we will be thinking about after the kind of Zoom room here closes today. So it's been wonderful having you with us this afternoon, and please take a look at our website, the SHAAP website, for the report and other reports, media releases and briefings and so on, which we have there, and webinars of other events like this. And we hope that we'll see you again soon at a future event. Thank you.